Well, good morning. It is wonderful to be back at Lake George and to share an update on the Jefferson project. But I'm really doing this on behalf of literally the hundreds of researchers that work on this project, from our partners, President Jackson at RPI, as well as the fund. So this work represents, again, an incredible amount of work. Now, it was the summer of 2013 that we gathered here to announce the Jefferson project. And at that time, we set some pretty aspirational goals, but goals that we thought were absolutely critical for not only the future of Lake George, but for freshwater in general on a global basis. And we sort of made a profound statement that we would make Lake George the smartest lake in the world through instrumentation and compute. We said we would use that information then to inform the decisions around the preservation of Lake George. And as I said, but it wasn't just about Lake George. We said we would do it in such a way that we could quickly export that technology to other freshwater bodies that were in harm's way on a global basis. And I'll show you some progress we've made along those lines. And then we said that this is not a short-term battle. This is a long-term war. And we needed to establish a platform and a capability here at Lake George that would be the hub of freshwater research in perpetuity. And we're well on our way for that. So let me give you now an update on each of these points. We said the way we would do this is through partnership, as Jeff said. And we assembled what I have repeatedly referred to as the Dream Team. The Fund for Lake George, and of course their presence here at the lake and passion for advocacy of fresh water and informed decision-making, science-based decisions. Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, the oldest technological institute in the country with tremendous horsepower in biology, mechanical engineering, sensors, and computer science. A perfect partner for us, and with a presence here at the Darren Freshwater Institute right on the lake in Bolton. And then, of course, IBM with all of our technology and computational horsepower. And we put these together around the goals that I shared, an unprecedented partnership, frankly, any place in the world. That team can do just about anything when it comes to freshwater science. The way we said we would go about that, to refresh your memory, is we said we would set up a monitoring system on the lake that is second to none any place on the globe. We said we would do experiments, both in labs and in water, around the effects of human and other forms of invasive species, et cetera, on the lake. And then we said we would build computational computer models that, again, were second to none in the world, and we would model every single aspect of this lake at a level of detail that's never been done before for any other freshwater body, and bring from Rensselaer and IBM the world's most powerful supercomputers to model this lake. And that was the way we said we would go about doing this. We also said that this was, again, not just a 1 or 2 year project, but that this was probably a decade-long endeavor to establish this capability. In phase 1, we began very rapidly after that initial meeting in 2013 to map out the lake. You'll remember the boats, the planes flying over the lake to map the waters, the depth of the water, the bathymetry of the lake, build the computer capability, and start to deploy sensors. In the second phase, which we're just about complete now in the second 3 years of the project, we said we would complete the deployment of the technology, gather data, and start to inform decisions, which you'll see we have done. And then going into next year, we'll enter a phase where we finalize our studies, our recommendations, and set up this monitoring system, again, in perpetuity to protect the lake, but also have here at Lake George the world-class freshwater research institute that can be leveraged not only here on Lake George, but throughout the state, the country, and the world. And that will be our third phase of this project. So how have we done? Well, this is, trust me, the smartest lake in the world by far. There are 500 sensors around this lake, measuring everything from water to water chemistry, to weather, to wind, to invasive species, to you name it. But not just the lake, the watershed itself, which plays an incredibly important role in what's going on in this lake. And you can see we have vertical profilers in the lake in the upper left. We have now sensors in streams, even in the winter, measuring the salt runoff through those streams and the velocity of the water, as well as weather stations posted all over the lake. The amount of data coming from this is unbelievable. To date, we've collected 500 million data points on this lake. And each of those data points are multiplied by millions as we create the computer models. So the data and the information and the insights that we're getting on this lake are second to none. And again, are allowing us not only to look at what's happening in the lake, but I'll show you later, project what will happen to the lake in the future. So again, an incredibly smart lake. So what have we found? Well, we've talked over the past couple of years a lot about the salt, and of course we discussed it a few minutes ago. And if you'll recall, we found in the original 30-year study of Lake George at Darren and the fund that basically salt had tripled over the last 30 years in the lake. Still at levels in the body of the lake below what we believe are harmful. They're certainly not harmful to humans, but not harmful to the biology of the lake. But we also know that as we went up the streams that feed the lake, we were finding salt levels as high as 1,000 times what's in the lake. That is harmful for life that feeds the lake. So this is a big problem as you get up into the feeder system of the lake. And you can see that it continues to climb. The last data point on this chart is 2018. So we're now instrumented as the salt reductions occur that you heard about before from the plows. We're instrumented to capture it as this curve hopefully bends over and should bend over. And over time, as I'll show you in a few charts, return to more natural levels of salt in the lake. Last year I said we were going to pivot up the streams looking for salt. We did that. We found tremendous amount of salts coming from the roads into the streams and then into the lake. A new finding this year is we took the data from those smart trucks that you heard earlier. We fed that data into our computers, and that plus our weather models and our soil runoff models allowed us to conclude something which surprised all of us quite a bit. And that is that not only is the salt coming down these streams, you can see here our measurements and modeling of salt in Finkelbrook, and you can see the salt levels on these bars moving up and down and spiking as we get bad weather and high salt events. So we are getting significant salt down the streams. But we're also, with our computer models and this data from the trucks now, finding that it's not just coming from the streams. If you look at the map of the lake here, that red sort of halo around the lake is our salt sources from groundwater and runoff that are not coming through the major streams. And I won't take you through all the work we've done, but basically 40 to 50% of the salt entering the lake is not coming through the major streams. It's coming down through groundwater and into the lake. That says we have not only these sort of high concentration points in the streams, but we have a halo, if you will, of salt sources around the lake. And so back to Chris's point and Eric's point, it's not enough to just reduce the salt on the 9 ends of the lake. We've got to reduce it on all of our properties around the lake to be able to reduce the overall salt level, because it's getting in every place, if you will, around the lake. But again, we're instrumented now to capture these salt reductions. Now, beyond salt, we began to tackle this question of algal blooms, and particularly harmful algal blooms, which are thought to be the result of lots of nutrients in the lake and temperature and other things that would cause the water to turn green as the algal just replicates. So we decided to take this on as the next big thing, if you will. And we found, fortunately, that nutrient levels in the lake, an oligotrophic lake like Lake George, are fairly low, although we do see signs of high densities of algae in the lake, but deeper in the lake. Last year, 1 year from, I think tomorrow was our date last year, I remember hearing about the blooms that were occurring on Skaneateles Lake. And they had had a horrible bloom the fall before. And I think I was standing like in that aisle over there after the meeting, and I said to Harry Kolar and the RPI team, I said, guys, let's get a sensor platform on Skaneateles Lake, and let's see if we can't collect the data that precedes a bloom and capture the bloom. And they said, that's a pretty good idea. We can do that next year. And I said, no, it's July 7th. I want it in by July 30th. After they picked themselves up, they immediately that afternoon went into action. And as you can see from the date stamp on this chart, by July 31st, we had one of the platforms from Lake George, the vertical sensor platforms, positioned on Skaneateles Lake. 4 days later, they had a bloom. 4 days later. And we captured it. And we captured it. The data from it as well as the computational models. Now, as background, the sort of the general sense of HABs was that, well, there's lots of nutrients from it getting into the lake, it's a calm day, it's warm, algae just blooms. It's that simple. It's not that simple. It's not that simple, as I'll show you right now. This is, for those of you that aren't familiar, Skaneateles Lake. It is a long, narrow lake, but two things I would cause you to look at here. Obviously, the green that Eric referenced, and when these things go bad, they go really bad. But also, look how flat it is around the lake. There's a lot of agriculture that goes on around the lake as opposed to Lake George, which, of course, is protected more by mountains. And so our watershed tends to be smaller. Here's the two lakes side by side. Roughly speaking, well, first of all, they're both oligotropic lakes, which means they are and should be nutrient starved, which is why our water is so clear. That is the starting point. Lake George is, call it twice as long, but Skaneateles is roughly twice as deep. You can see our shoreline is dramatically different, but you can see that we're surrounded by that light green mountainous area. They have very flat land around, and again, high levels of agriculture. And we have not seen major HABs. They obviously now are seeing them almost routinely, unfortunately. So we went to work on this. And now you're looking at multiple signals coming from that lake, from that vertical profile. It's the leftmost one, I believe, is temperature. The second one is turbidity, which is sort of the cloudiness of the water. And then each of the other ones is one portion of the chemistry of that lake. Vertically on each one of those charts is the depth of the lake, from the surface of the lake to the very bottom of the lake. And what we experienced on Skaneateles Lake was a couple of days before the bloom, there was a major storm with winds from the north that caused that lake to really, like Lake George in a north wind, really get riled up. No bloom. It sits still for a while. And then we started to pick up that signal of the turbidity of the water, the cloudiness of the water deep, deep in the water near the bottom, which is that red spike, which said, okay, something is going on near the bottom of this lake, because soon after that event, the algal bloom occurred. So we took all of this data, again, an immense amount of data on the chemistry, on the weather, on the best bathymetry of the lake we could have, and we built a computer model that mimicked the data. And here's what we found. This is a cross section. Think of yourself cutting the lake in half, Skaneateles, and looking at it from the top of the water to the bottom. The black on the bottom would be the bottom of the lake, and you're looking north. The north end would be on the left. The right side is the south end. And these are temperature strata in the lake. And you'll see something highly unusual. You'll see this back and forth movement of the thermal lines in the lake, particularly along the bottom, and occasionally it gets red. That's the velocity of the water. So basically what happens in this lake, which we've seen in Lake George, these called sage waves, where we see surface waves all the time, but deep in the lake, these lakes have waves that move up and down, sort of in a bathtub motion, deep in the lake. And because of the direction of that lake and the nutrients that have been buried in the bottom sediment of that lake, conditions set up to bring that nutrient up, as we saw in that turbidity near the bottom, the right wind conditions and temperature, and an algal bloom occurs. So basically, the makings of HABs in Skaneateles Lake are at the bottom of that lake in the north end. And you can see when that sage wave hits that north end, right in that lower left-hand corner, all heck breaks loose. And the sediment comes up, the nutrients come up, and away we go. So now we're working with the lake on what could we do now to help prevent these things from occurring in the future. Again, this is just one example, though, of the complexity of what's going on. It's not as simple as the lake is still, the water gets warm, algae grows. It's much, much more complex. I will say that it's a great thing we did that, because that particular phenomenon, at least, we will not see in Lake George. We will not see that cause. It's not to say it's the only cause, but we'll not see that cause in Lake George. Can we skip forward, or do I need to click? Okay. So that's the story on HABs. As you heard, we're now looking at other lakes out in the Finger Lake region, which tend to be oriented, as you remember, sort of north-south, to see if we see similar phenomena. Lots more technology to come. At Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, we're putting mesocosm systems in the lake to do experiments, again, in the water chemistry. Here you'll see them off of the Darren Freshwater Institute. Some of the best technologists in the world at RPI are looking at very, very small sensors for phosphorus, which is one of the nutrients. Our plan would be to deploy an array of these in the lake to not only measure the phosphorus and nutrients, but through that array, isolate where are the nutrients coming from. And then lastly, we intend to put together a lot of this data into a dashboard, a public dashboard, where all of you will be able to go onto a website and see what's going on in the lake in real time. In addition to that, we're deploying very simple sensors for algae in the lake, which many of you have begun to deploy around your docks. So that's sort of where we are. Tremendous progress in understanding not only Lake George, but deploying the technology to other lakes, not just to help other lakes, but to inform us here on Lake George, what are the do's and don'ts, and what do we need to watch for? But those I think of as, those are the battles in the war. The war is what happens to this lake over the long term. Because we can keep the invasive species out, we can take the salt down, but there are many, many more things that are happening on a long-term basis in this lake. So to address that, we built something called a scenario engine. It's an enormous computer model, which you can think of as a time machine, that we can look forward in time, not just 6 months or a year, but decades, and model what could happen to this lake under different conditions. And I'll give you just one example of that. So we've built a model, this scenario engine, where we divide the lake up into a number of pieces, and we put 100 or more parameters into this model, assumptions around salt levels, around the biology, around the climate, et cetera, and then computer model forward what could happen to the lake in the coming years and the coming decades. It's the most sophisticated model I certainly know about in any freshwater body. Our best computer models that we were running before take us about 3 hours to do a high-density weather forecast 36 hours from now. In 1 minute, this computer model can model Lake George a decade or more into the future. So extremely powerful computing. So what are we finding? We took just one example, salt, and said, okay, what will happen to Lake George and its various basins as we reduce salt? And here's a computer model, the salt density versus the next 5 years. It runs out to 2024. If we reduce the salt by 50%, which is what we heard is our goal. And what we find is, indeed, it will, over the next 5 years, reduce the salt level by about 30% in the lake. You might ask, well, why doesn't it go down 50%? Well, that's because there's a lag time in getting the salt out of the ground and soil that I showed you earlier. But reducing by 50% in 5 years should reduce the salt in the lake by 30%, which is quite substantial. And you also see the spikes, which is the winter salting, being reduced. And you can see that, of course, the South Basin is worse because of the road density versus the North Basin. We then say, okay, well, that's interesting, 5 years. What happens if we run it out for the next 20 years to 2040? And this is what would happen to the salt levels in the lake on the left. The data I showed you in the last chart was just that little red box on the left, but we can now blow it out 20 years and say, what will happen to the salt levels in this basin? And you can see that we should be able to drop the salt levels to about 10 milligrams per liter, which is getting down not to, but pretty close to, or within 2x, what the natural salt in this lake should be. So the actions we're taking now to cut the salt in half should take this down to a close to pristine state in the next 2 decades. If we don't do that, and God forbid we were to be increasing salt, which was the path we were on, you can see what happens on the right. The spikes get more intense, and the average salt levels increase dramatically over the next 2 decades. So we're making the right decisions. We believe we know what the impacts will be. Now we need to stay the course on that. So wrapping up, I think we have achieved the vast majority of our goals to date. There is no question, by far, this is the smartest lake in the world. I was over in Europe a couple of weeks ago looking at Lake Zurich. No sensors, no nothing. And that is part of the economic equation of that portion of Switzerland. Nothing like this. We're informing decisions, whether it's around salt or now decisions around nutrients that are entering the lake. And we have successfully, in days, taken the technology from this lake to a neighboring lake in New York State and found incredible results. And lastly, now we're on a path to harden these assets and put this in place for perpetuity to protect this lake. And I'll just end with, again, a thought which says, I've now reached a point where I believe with the technology we've deployed and the partnerships we have and the dedication to this lake, that we will win the battles for the water purity of this lake. I think the question moves then to, will we win the war? And the war is 1, 2, 3 decades, not even our children, but our grandchildren and their grandchildren. And one thing we're starting to contemplate is not what we're doing short-term to the lake, but what will happen to the lake in 50 or 100 years due to not road salt, but climate change. And we know that the number of winters that the lake is icing over is decreasing. It's just not icing the way it used to. Strangely enough, when I was at that Lake Zurich, the driver told me, he says, I've lived here all my life. I said, there's ice over all the time. He said, it used to, it doesn't sometimes anymore. And so we're thinking about not only monitoring the long-term effects of climate and humans on the lake, but we're thinking about, can we use the lake as one of the largest detectors of climate change in the world with these very sensitive detectors, so that we can not only inform activity around the lake, but inform the more global institutions that are worried about climate change. A big goal, a big, bodacious, hairy goal, as President Jackson would say, but one that we think we're up to, not just for Lake George, but for the globe. Thank you very much.